So chapter 1, Introduction to Human Anatomy. So anatomy is a study of, basically all of the human anatomy is a study of all the human anatomical structures in the body, naming those structures and defining what their functions are. And then physiology is where you learn how each of those structures performs specifically its function. So you take anatomy first, you learn all the names of all the structures, and from cells to groups of cells, which are tissues, to tissues working together, and we call those organs. And then organs working together, we call those organ systems. So like the heart pumps blood, and the respiratory system or the lungs exchanges gas. So we get oxygen into our blood and carbon dioxide out of our blood. And so those are two organ systems that work together, the heart and the lungs. It's cardiorespiratory. So in anatomy, we're naming all of those things. In physiology, which you will take next, is where you actually learn how the respiratory system exchange gases and so forth. All living things have these 5 basic properties. So responsiveness, living organisms have to respond and adapt, meaning you have to eat, you have to move, you have to keep responding, or the organism will die. Growth and differentiation, in order to stay alive, you have to have cells replaced, and those cells have to do different jobs. So they start off stem cells, and then those stem cells will differentiate or change into different types of cells to perform specific functions. And we'll talk about that when we get to cells and tissues. Living organisms have to reproduce, or that organism will cease to live, because organisms don't live forever. And if they don't reproduce, then it will vanish off the earth. Movement, there's external movement and internal movement. So external movement obviously is the organism moving around physically. Internal movement, though, would be, say, your blood moving through your arteries and veins, or food moving through the digestive tract, right? Or blood moving through the cardiovascular system. So that would be internal movement. Metabolism and excretion. Well, we need to take in food and then break down that food so we can absorb it into the bloodstream. And then we take those molecules that we absorb, like carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, and we build them back up into carbohydrate stores. And that term is anabolism. And then we use those stored carbohydrates eventually to produce ATP, which is what our cells use for energy. And the cells have to create ATP from the absorbed nutrients, and that uses oxygen. So we need oxygen to create ATP. So that's why we actually use or breathe in oxygen. And hopefully you kind of remember that from biology. That's called cellular respiration. All of these things have to continue, or the organism will cease to be living. So the next couple of slides are just for you to kind of go back over, take notes, know the 5 things. Responsiveness, adaptability is super important. Growth, organisms have to grow, and the cells have to differentiate. They have to continue to reproduce, or we call that extinction of a species. Movement, there's internal movement and external movement. Metabolism, again, this is to create ATP for the cells, energy source, and we use oxygen to create ATP. So here are some terms and definitions that you should familiarize yourself with. And just basic overview, we start off in anatomy. So today, this chapter is all about organization and terminology, and just basic things you're going to have to know throughout the semester. Then chapter 2 is cytology, talking about cells. Chapter 3 is histology, talking about tissues. Histology is the study of tissues. So, by the way, ology means study of. Then after chapter 3, we get into organ systems, right? So we go to organ systems. And the first organ system is the integumentary system. That is skin, hair, nails. I kind of refer to it as the money pit. Although these days, most of us are probably not spending too much money on it because we can't, sadly. And then we go into skeletal system, muscular system, and all the rest of the organ systems. There are different ways to study anatomy. There's comparative anatomy. So you're basically studying, fish versus chickens versus humans. You're comparing the differences in those anatomies. There's developmental anatomy. You're studying one thing as it develops. So humans from an embryo to a full-grown human. We don't study that way. We study systemic anatomy. And systemic anatomy is looking at the organ systems as we go through each one. So that's what we look at. It's important to understand levels of organization. So what you have to realize is most everything in your body is made up of a combination of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. So those 4 elements make up almost 99.9% of the molecules and cell structures and tissues of our body. That's the building blocks or structures, those 4 elements. And so these molecules are made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, and they combine to form structures, and these structures kind of combine to form cells. And so here's the level of the cells, right? And so this is chemical molecule. So cells, when they are next to each other and performing a certain function in an area, we then refer to it as a tissue. So tissues are groups of cells performing a function. Now, there are 4 primary tissue types. So 4 basic tissue types. And those are epithelial, connective tissue, muscle, and neural. And we'll talk about that when we get to tissues. Now, if you have these 4 basic tissue types all working together in a system, we call that an organ. So organs are these tissue types all combining to perform a function. And when they're working to perform a job, we call it an organ system. Oops, organ, I can't spell. Let's erase that because it's really ugly. And let's see. So these are all organs. And then when all of the organs are together working for the organism, so these are all organ systems. And when you have all the organ systems working together, we call this the organism. So that's the organism. So this goes through levels of organization from smallest to largest. Now here's the thing. If something is wrong, you don't have the right amounts of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, or hydrogen, that means the cellular structures are not going to work. That means the cell's not going to work. That means the tissue's not going to work. That means the organ's not going to work. And that means the organism's not going to work, right? So if there is something structurally wrong, either at a chemical level or a cellular level, something's not working in the cell, or a structure is not built correctly, then the cell dies. And if the cell dies, then the tissue dies. And if the tissue dies, then the organ dies. So an example of this would be a heart attack, right? It's also called a myocardial infarction, right? So an MI. Now what happens is the heart muscle doesn't get enough oxygen. And if the heart muscle cell doesn't get enough oxygen because there's a blockage in a coronary artery, which is the artery that serves oxygen to the heart muscle cell, if there's no oxygen, then the cell can't produce ATP, right? So no oxygen, no ATP, no energy. So that equals no energy. If there's no energy, then it can no longer contract. So no contraction. If the heart muscle, if the heart muscle can't contract, then the blood does not get pumped to the rest of the body. And if the blood doesn't get pumped to the rest of the body, then this guy dies. So what I'm trying to say is each level is dependent on the level above it, or that is more structurally small. And so that is what's meant by they're all dependent on one another. Again, these are things you should read. It's terms that I have just used. So tissues are groups of cells and cell products working towards a specific function. With anatomy, you always want to learn the definitions and any functions. So these are all definitions. You need to know the definition of a tissue, the definition of an organ, definition of an organ system, homeostasis. That is a term that I'm sure you had to become familiar with in biology. Your body needs to keep things moving relatively the same. That is homeostasis in order to be able to control all of the processes. So again, review levels of organization. The chemical molecular level, smallest. The cell, smallest living unit of the body. So tissues are groups of cells and the surrounding products and materials that help those cells do their jobs. That's what a tissue is. And again, the 4 primary tissue types. So these are the primary tissue types. And yes, you need to know what are the 4, well, this looks like it goes with that, primary, that's primary tissue types. And then when you have a combination of these primary tissue types, we call them an organ. And then you have organ systems. So there are 11 organ systems we're going to go through, and you need to go through this chart. Let's see. And it has stopped mirroring. So let's try this again. And we're back. Okay. So I went through these. If you didn't get it, we're going to iron this out. So this first lecture is going to be a little botched, but I think I went through basically this. So you can review my heart attack, right? The smallest to largest being dependent on one another. Please review the definitions and the levels of organization, right? So we've gone through all this. The cell, the 4 primary tissue types, the organ systems, and we're going to talk about the 11 organ systems. So I want you guys to go through these and read through organ system, integumentary system. What are its major functions? You need to know each organ system and the major function of that organ system. So we're going to do integumentary system. That's chapter 4. And then the skeletal system is 5 through 8. And this is 9 through 11. 13 through 18, and this is chapter 19 is endocrine. These are hormones, right? Hormones. And then we have the cardiovascular system, which is 20 through 22. That is blood, heart, and circulatory system. So those are blood vessels. So arteries and veins. And then we have the lymphatic system. So this is your immune response system. Respiratory system. And so, by the way, that's 23. This is 24. Respiratory system. This is really for gas exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide. We need to get oxygen into our blood in order to allow for the cells to create ATP. And in the creation of ATP, you have carbon dioxide being produced. So we got to get rid of that since our bodies can't use carbon dioxide. We have digestive system. This is taking in food and nutrients for the sole purpose of then taking the energy out of food and putting that energy into the bonds of the ATP molecules. So that is digestive system. We also need to take in minerals and vitamins and water because our bodies can't make that stuff. We use minerals for a number of things, and you get to learn all about that in physio. 26 is the urinary system. This is the kidneys. So kidneys filter your blood, and they get rid of the things we don't want. So elimination of waste in the blood, or I should say from the blood, so we can excrete it out as urine. And last but not least, we have the the reproductive system. So that's last. The other really important stuff in this chapter, and I'm going to shove my cat out of the way, because even though you can't see my cat, it's a really large fat cat that keeps trying to step on my iPad. So we all have to speak the same language. When you're dealing with medicine, the human body, we can't rely on our just regular vernacular language. We have to have a very specific language so we don't misinterpret or misunderstand one another. And so if we relied on people just to use plain language, there can be a lot of confusion. What are we talking about? The front of the arm. Well, where exactly on the front of the arm? Oh, you know, the upper arm. No, I don't know the upper arm. So instead of getting into that kind of dialogue, we use the terms brachial, because the brachium is a specific area of the upper arm. Antecubital area is a specific area of the upper limb, and the antebrachium is another specific area of the upper limb. So we use anatomical terms to be very specific about what we're talking about, and it eliminates any variation between what I think something should be called and what someone else thinks something should be called. It's called what it was named, right? So you could say, well, I don't like saying Ulrich, so I'm going to call you Professor Smith, because it's easier to say Smith. Well, that's not my name. My name is Ulrich. So when we name things with anatomical names, those are its names. Everybody uses it, and there's no confusion. So that is why you have to learn all of the anatomical names. And so when we talk about anatomy, we always make reference to anatomical position. So with a human, anatomical position is standing with your feet flat on the floor, toes pointed forward, hands and arms down at your sides with your palms facing forward. This is really important because when we talk about the front of something and the back of something, the front are the palms, but you can be standing looking straight ahead with your feet straight ahead, and you can have your palms facing back because your radius or your radial bone can move and roll over the ulnar bone, pronating your hands, making your hands go so you could see the back of your hands. But since we have to be very specific, I want to tell you specifically anatomical position is your palms facing forward. So your palms are anterior or in front, and the back of your hands are posterior behind. So anatomical position is very specific. Now, if you're laying down and not standing up, it's said that you are supine if you're lying down but face up. If you are prone, you are lying down, but you're face down. So those are very specific. So the question, if you were swimming the backstroke, would you be supine or prone? And you would be supine. If you were swimming freestyle, would you be supine or prone? And that would mean you were swimming prone. So hopefully that kind of explains it. So that's anatomical position, and everything is always going to be in reference to anatomical position. Now, there's anatomical directions that are very specific. So let's talk about these. Anterior is the front of something, and posterior is the back. They have a second name. Ventral is front, and dorsal is back. You can say anterior, you can say ventral. You can say posterior, you can say dorsal. They both work. Superior is high, and inferior is low, or top and bottom. Now, cranial can be used for your top. Caudal can be used up until the end of your vertebral column. That is where the caudal or your tail ends. So generally speaking, if you're talking about something being high or something being low, we tend to use superior, inferior. It's like above or below. An example of that is saying my cranium or head is superior to my thorax, which would be my body, right? My thorax is inferior to my cranium. So that's kind of how we use those. Anterior, posterior, you would use it by saying my heart is anterior to my spinal cord, which is posterior. So these terms are used to describe the location of something. Okay, so sections and planes, this is how we cut things up. So cut up organisms, right? So there are 3 planes. So if you have an organism, here's my stick figure because I really am not a good drawer. I can cut this person into a superior half and an inferior half. And that would be a transverse plane. So transverse plane is a perpendicular plane, right? So here's the organism going this way, and this is perpendicular. You're cutting through perpendicular to the organism. That is a transverse plane. It basically splits things into a top and a bottom, or a superior half and an inferior half. Now, if you take an organism and you want to split it into a sagittal section, which would be here, you are actually going to then split it right here, and you then split into a right half and a left half. So it's down through the organism. Now, if it's directly in the middle, it's called a mid-sagittal. If it's not, perfectly middle, it's called a parasagittal. I should say through middle. It's parasagittal. Now, a frontal plane is going to be, so let's do frontal, and I'm going to make my little person here. So here's my person, and a frontal plane actually is going to split it into a right and a left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that stick figure and, whoops, and I'm going to make the stick figure from the side, right? So here's the side view. So from the side, you're going to split it down the side like this, and you're going to break it into an anterior half and a posterior half. So that is what a frontal section does, splits into a front and a back. So when you go through your textbook, you're going to notice if they're dissecting up something, it's always going to say, or if they're showing you, say, a view of a cranial skull, they're going to tell you what you're looking at. Is it a sagittal section? Is it a frontal section? Is it transverse? They're gonna describe what you're looking at in terms of how it's shown. Is it what plane is it shown in? Supine and prone we went over, and the last are relative directions. Okay, so relative. Medial refers to towards the middle. Lateral refers to away from the middle. And so if you have a person here, if it's something that is towards the middle, you would say it's medial. If you have something that is kind of out, it would be lateral. And these are relative directions because we're talking about it being relative to something else. So that is to say, when we look at, so I'll stick with relative, these are anatomical names that you need to know. So the axilla or armpit, right? It's right here. It's your axilla. That is the noun or name for your armpit. So you can no longer call it your armpit. It is your axilla. Axillary, that's the adjective version. Meaning if you're describing a nerve that runs in that area. So if a nerve runs through that region, then we refer to that nerve as your axillary nerve. The nerve is the noun, right? Because that's a thing. Axillary is the adjective describing where that nerve is located. So that's the difference between the bold and the bold in parentheses. On your first exam, you can use the noun or adjective. You can no longer use the unbolded words. Those are gone from your lexicon this semester or your language. You can only use the bolded ones, whether it be the noun or the adjective. Now back to talking about relative directions here, right? So if I was talking about your axilla in relationship to your antebrachium, let me do this a little bit better. So I'm talking about describing where your axilla is to your antebrachium. You would say that the axilla is medial to antebrachium. Okay, so axilla is medial to antebrachium. But if I'm talking about the antebrachium to your pollex or thumb, the antebrachium is now medial to the pollex, which is lateral. So these are relative terms. It's relative to whatever else you're talking about. So things can be medial to some things, but lateral to other things. And so when you're describing, say, a laceration or cut, right? So I'm going to say, oh, he has a laceration on the leg, and it was right here. You would say a laceration in the femoral area. So a femoral laceration that's lateral. So you would say a lateral femoral cut or laceration, right? So you're describing where it is. If the cut was here, then you would say it's a medial, because this would be more medial. And then you can also start using the relative terms distal and proximal. So proximal and distal are used for arms and legs. And it's really important to understand that proximal and distal are terms used for your arms and legs or your appendages. So when you're referencing things on your arms and legs, proximal is going to be closer to the attachment site. So on your legs, this is your attachment site. On your arms, this is your attachment site. So when something is here, you're going to say it's proximal. If something is here, you would say distal. Proximal would be here. Whoops, I need to do that. Distal would be down here. So we use that, and I'll get back to this, is this lateral femoral cut. It would be a proximal lateral femoral cut. This right here would be distal, right? Medial femoral cut. So you can describe to another PA or physician or nurse where they will be having to sew up this cut, right? So if you're working as a nurse and you're in the ER and you're doing triage, so a person comes in and they have a laceration on their arms and legs, you're going to want to put in your notes whether it's proximal or distal, whether it's lateral or medial, and what area of the body it's on. And so that is why we have to learn these anatomical terms. So you can use a very specific language that the other person has also learned, and so there's no miscommunication about where things are and what you're talking about. So it's really important that you go through these anatomical names, right? So here, you have to, again, memorize that this is the frons as a noun or frontal area as an adjective. Your eye is your oculus or the orbital or ocular area. Ear is your oris or otic area. So if you get ear drops because you have an ear infection, on those drops it will say otic solution. If you get eye drops though, it will say ocular solution. So you actually have seen a lot of these anatomical terms, you just don't really know, like the game cranium, because your brain is inside your cranium, and that's why they show you a brain. Cephalon is your head, that includes your cranium and your facies or face or facial. Oris or oral is mouth. Oral solutions are meant to go in your mouth. Mentis is your chin. Cervicis is your neck. We have cervical vertebra. We have thoracic vertebra. That's in the thoracic area here, right? Mamma or mammillaries, breast, abdomen or abdominal, umbilicus or umbilical, pelvic areas here, or pelvis. That is different than inguinal or inguine. So inguinal or inguine is this area here. You have inguinal ligaments right there. So that is the inguinal area. On the opposite side, again, we have axilla or axillary, that's your armpit. Brachium is the upper arm. Antecubitus or antecubital is right in the front of your elbow. Antebrachial is the lower part. Carpus or wrist is carpus is your wrist. Carpal, you guys, I'm sure have heard carpal tunnel syndrome. So when you say carpal tunnel syndrome, it's a tunnel syndrome. It's a tendon sheath syndrome or inflammation, and it's in the carpal area. So that's why it's carpal tunnel syndrome. You have pollex or thumb. So you can only call your thumb your pollex. Your palm or palmar area, and then your digits. You can call them phalanges or digits, both work. You have the femur, which is your upper leg or femoral area. You have your patella, right, or patellar area, it's your kneecap. Crus, this is the front of your lower leg. It's your crus or curl area. Your tarsus is your ankle. And pes is your foot. Hallux is your big toe. So pollex is your thumb, hallux is your big toe, but digits and phalanges work for your fingers 2 through 5 and your toes 2 through 5. On the back side, same thing, cephalon, cephalic, cervix is cervical, shoulder. It is no longer your shoulder, this is your acromion. Your back is your dorsum or dorsal area. Dorsal is another name for your back. Remember, ventral is front and dorsal is back. Just think of dolphins, right? They have fins on their back called dorsal fins. Olecranon, that is your elbow. This is the olecranon process, right? So we're going to get rid of those. Lumbar or lower back is your lumbus. It's your upper limb, that's your lower limb. Most of you guys know that your butt is referred to as your gluteus. Back of your knee, less common. It's the popliteus. Now, the front of your lower limb, the lower part of your lower limb is your crus, but the back is your sura or calf. So remember, crus is the front and the back is your sura or surus. Your heel is your calcaneus. This is your calcaneal bone. And the bottom of your foot is your planta. You've heard of an inflammation of the tendon on the bottom of your foot. It's a big flat tendon, and it's called plantar fasciitis. So it's an inflammation of the fascia, a big tendinous sheath on the bottom of your foot on your plantar surface. So it's called plantar fasciitis. So we name a lot of things just for location. So this is the newer guy, and you do have labeling diagrams, and your first exam will ask whether you know these anatomical names and terms. So please memorize these. You do that by printing out labeling diagrams and label over and over and over again. This is a chart that tells you the anatomical name, region, and area. So if you like charts better, great. You will also have this diagram that you need to know. So again, when looking at this, we tend to use superior and inferior because caudal stops here, right? So cranial, caudal, high and low. Anterior is front or ventral, and posterior dorsal is back. Lateral is to the side of the organism, and medial is towards the center. When we're talking about arms and legs, we use not superior or inferior, we use proximal, which is closer to the attachment site, or distal, farther away, right? So proximal equals closer to attachment of limb. Distal, farther from attachment site of limb. So that's when we use proximal or distal, right? So the pollex is distal to the axilla or to the antecubital area, right? Antecubital area is distal to the axilla. So they're relative to kind of what you're talking about. So this goes through and explains all of those directions. Please be able to fill out these diagrams and understand them, as well as planes and sections. So again, you need to know the difference between a sagittal plane, a frontal plane, and a transverse plane. MRI, CTs, X-rays, they will always describe things. If you get an X-ray of your arm, it will say medial. If it's a medial view, it'll say lateral. If it's a lateral view, it will use these terminologies to explain to the person reading the X-ray, MRI, CT, what they're looking at. Okay, last thing in this chapter is body cavities, and you are going to have to know what body cavities are. Cavities are spaces, okay? So body cavities, a cavity is a space. And in bodies, the space is created by membranes. So body cavities are just the membranes creating a space. And so we have these membranes creating space in the posterior and in the anterior areas. So we call them the posterior cavity, and instead of anterior cavity, it's been historically referred to as the ventral body cavity. So the posterior cavity we don't talk about a lot. That's the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. So basically the cranium are bones that go around, they're bones that surround the brain. Okay, so the brain is in the cranial cavity, but it's the cavity is actually made up of the bones. And for the spinal cord, it's made up of the vertebral bones that surround the spinal cord. So the vertebral bones are the spinal cavity. What's inside of the spinal cavity is the spinal cord. What's inside of the cranial cavity is the brain. As far as the ventral body cavity, so this goes through dorsal body cavities, right? The ventral body cavity is a little more complex. It's in front of the spinal cord. It's ventral. It's front to the spinal cord and brain, so we call it the ventral body cavity. It's split into two really distinct cavities, and the first is the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is your thoracic area, so it's your rib cage, basically, and what's inside the rib cage. So you have a right and left lung, right? So you have these membranes that surround right and left lung, and the membranes surrounding the lung are creating the pleural cavity. So the membranes create that space, and that is what the cavity is. It's a space or a hole. And so the lung is in the pleural cavity. You have to use the term pleural cavities. There's two, right? Because you have a right and a left lung. The stuff in between your lungs that goes down behind the heart is the mediastinum. So, or it doesn't all go behind the heart, but you have your trachea, esophagus, aorta, inferior vena cava. These are the major vessels. So it's the stuff in the middle. So the mediastinum is a fancy word for stuff in between lungs or pleural cavities. Okay, so that's mediastinum. Pericardial cavity are the membranes surrounding the heart. And one thing, peri, when it's before a word, it basically means surrounds. So peri is saying surrounds, cardial is referring to the heart, and so pericardial means it's surrounding the heart. Now, after that, you have a muscle called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that basically produces breathing, quiet breathing. And the diaphragm completely seals off the thoracic body cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. So diaphragm completely separates these two cavities. Once you're below the diaphragm, it's called the abdominopelvic cavity, but it consists really of two cavities. One is the abdominal cavity and one is the pelvic cavity. So pelvic cavity has the urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the last part of your digestive tract, and everything else in your abdominal cavity. Everything else is in the abdominal cavity. So the upper part of your GI tract, your liver, your stomach, your pancreas, those kind of things. Now, there are membranes that surround some of the stuff in the abdominopelvic cavity, and that is the peritoneum or peritoneal membranes. But the peritoneal membranes in the abdominopelvic cavity don't surround every single organ, so it's a little bit different there. When you look at this, it kind of shows you, here's the diaphragm, it's completely separating the thoracic body cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. So you do need to know what the pleural cavities are, what the mediastinum is, what the pericardial cavities are, the pleural cavity, and then the abdominal cavity and pelvic, and that those two combined make the abdominopelvic cavity. You will see this on a diagram. And so they're showing you a section view of the thoracic cavity. So here's where those planes come into. So it's showing you here, this is how you can kind of view your textbook. It's showing you this is a plane going here, perpendicular to the organism. And so what kind of view is this going to be? It's going to be a transverse planar view. We would just say transverse view, right? So they cut it into a superior and inferior. So you're looking down on the pericardial cavity where the heart is, and then here would be the lungs, and that would be your vertebra. So you can kind of orientate yourself. And then also what the books will do is they'll say, to describe things, it'll show you that this is the posterior and that this is anterior. So you can see what you're looking at, right? So you can orientate yourself to kind of see what they're trying to show you. So you'll notice that about the book, right? It uses anterior view of the ventral body cavity. Really important to read these. It really does explain a lot about what you're looking at. So this book is great for reading the diagrams. Read, diagram, print. So last thing with these body cavities is, remember, I said they are membrane cavities. They're serous membrane cavities. Serous membranes secrete a watery fluid that is here between the two membranes. So this would be serous fluid here in between. And so there are two distinct membranes. They are kind of combined, but I should make this a little bolder color here. So there's this membrane here. So the yellow is going to be the visceral pericardial membrane, right? So visceral pericardium. It is the membrane attached to the organ. Okay, so that's the visceral pericardium, this membrane. There is a second membrane that's on the outside. And so this membrane here is farther away, not attached to the organ itself. This is the parietal. So parietal is farther from organ. So you do need to know visceral and parietal for pericardium, which is the heart, but also you have a visceral pleural membrane, right? So you'll have a visceral pleural membrane and a parietal pleural membrane. The parietal pleural membrane is going to be up against the rib cage, whereas the visceral pleural membrane is going to be attached to the lung, right? And so this is by ribs. So understand the visceral and parietal membranes and where they are. The peritoneal cavity is this abdominopelvic cavity, but the peritoneal membranes don't surround everything. So that's why it looks kind of funky here. And then this is kind of showing you pelvic, but learn abdominopelvic. So this goes through body cavities. Again, important you understand the definition of parietal and visceral and be able to use those appropriately. Quadrants or regions, there's a 9-region way of doing things, and then there's the 4 quadrants. This tends to be what's used more in medicine, where you're describing things as an upper or lower quadrant and whether they're right or left. It's going through the umbilicus, right? So X straight through the umbilicus, and you have an upper right, right? So upper right quadrant and lower right quadrant, and then lower left quadrant and upper left quadrant. And so when someone's triaging, right, they'll ask you where your pain is, and a lot of times they'll say, oh, it's up here. And if you're pointing to your upper right quadrant area, they're going to automatically think gallbladder, possibly gallstones, or liver, or your right kidneys up there, part of your stomach. So you're trained to kind of know what organs are in the upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left, right? If it's lower right, first thing people think of is appendix, right? Spleen is on your upper left, as well as kidney. Stomach's kind of in the middle, so it can end up both. But really, you know, you have your ovaries in the females in the right and left lower quadrants. So it's important to kind of understand these abdominopelvic quadrants and the major organs that are kind of residing in those quadrants. It helps you figure it out where, you know, what you should be looking at. So this concludes the PowerPoint on chapter 1. After you go through it, make sure you write all your notes and have all your questions ready, and then we will address those when we go through our sessions together. So that's it for now.